Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of the War Report. And it looks like the Israel Palestine debacle, I don't even want to call it a conflict, that's not really a fair terminology for it, is finally simmering down. Now, what form will this take? Who is coming on top? Well, it looks like, of course, Israel has, because you thought the Palestinians were going to pull this off this time, didn't you? Well, I think, my friend, you were wrong. Maybe I'm talking to myself. Maybe I had a little too much hope that this would be the end, that would be Jover for Israel, but it looks like that is not the case. And moving on, there's been what is more or less a ceasefire. That's what they've been calling it. Declared by the Israeli government, declared by the White House, by Blinken and everything. Of course, Biden and his team putting out statements like, well, the Israel and Palestinians should both live in peace and they should learn to get along, smoke pot, and listen to John Lennon's Imagine. That's been sort of the rhetoric coming out of the White House is usually happens under a Democratic administration when there's troubles in Israel, at least I would say ever since the Clinton era. That's usually been the Democratic response. Now, of course, you've had the more openly pro Palestinian elements of the left stand up on this and grandstand on this, but it looks like this really was the January 6th of Palestine because they went all in, they launched all those rockets, it was supposed to be the third, intifada, but at the end of the day, look at where they are now. There were, again, the almost ground invasion of Gaza happened, and that was, of course, to lure out the troops and everything else. But again, it was a major defeat for Hamas and the Palestinians, not necessarily in a military sense, but in a PR sense, in an optical sense. Now, of course, they have all these voices coming out in support of them, but it's inconsequential. It's not going to do anything for them. It's not like a PR victory for Israel, where when people come out and support Israel, that's a good thing, and it bolsters them because again, the Palestinians don't have that clout for obvious reasons. And when you see this, you've seen elements on the left and leftist groups being just outright anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian, because again, that's a safe issue for them. That's a safe issue for our elite to sacrifice because they know these people's activism, BDS, whatever, try as they might to ban it, won't be the downfall of Israel. They know that for a fact, and especially Hamas, especially a lot of these campaigns that come from the American Western left in regard to Palestine don't present any real challenge to Israel. A thorn in the side at most. Again, it's not like these people are supporting the pro-Iranian axis of resistance. I mean, half these people want Assad out of Syria and think that he's just as bad as Israel. That's the angle they come at from. Most of them probably even couldn't tell you what Hezbollah is or even know there's war in Yemen or just know that Trump waged a war in Yemen, probably don't know that Biden is still doing it. But again, that's the angle they approach it from. And of course, you said they had a bunch of um, actors that were not of a certain tribe and again people of certain extractions and all these major public figures coming out in support of Israel, putting out these ads saying how much we love our greatest ally and how great it is we can stand by them and give them a big hug and kiss and just make nice with them. And I'll let you take over from there because you were telling me mostly about that.
Well, I mean, if you put the conflict between Israel and Palestine with in a historical context of, let's say, the last half century and what it has meant for the left and what the left has meant for it, it's been basically nothing, right? So the left has never been able to achieve anything for the Palestinians or for the Palestinian cause. And I think that goes to some extent in explaining why, uh, like, there weren't any Hollywood celebs who happened to be Jewish who stood up for Israel and denounced Hamas, right? Obviously, that would bring about, the frequent trope of dual loyalties. Uh, but I think it goes even deeper than that because it's a safe issue to be for Palestine, but not for actually achieving anything for Palestine. It's a small price to pay for for you know, being for Palestine, even as a Jew, because it will give you carte blanche to argue for more non-European descent migrants and immigrants into America, whether that's legal or not. It doesn't matter, right? So it's an important position to maintain. There's no worry that like being for Palestine or reducing aid to Israel is ever going to actually be achieved. It won't be achieved. So even if Bernie Sanders supports AOC in halting this latest aid package, and the aid package, 75% of the aid it goes to buy the arms. It's a subsidy program. It's literally like farm subsidies in that respect, right? Except it's for arms. So it's a safe position, and it's safer than most people suspect, right? Um, I think because they're aware of the level of influence that they have on American politics. What comes to mind, especially since we're talking about the left and the Democrats in general, is that famous APAC speech that she gave, where she was a guest, and she said, the Capitol building could be on fire, but we will not reduce aid to Israel by 1 cent.
The one thing that will remain true is that we will always stand with Israel. Nancy Pelosi out there bloviating and
Hashtag priorities.
oh yes, of course. And it is funny because after the January 6th incident, I'm pretty sure one of the first bills in Congress after that was some aid package to Israel.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it was already secured anyways, and Biden has already come out and said he's going to replenish their missile supplies, right? Obviously.
Oh, of course, the Iron Dome, the highly effective air defense system that kept the entire country safe from the clutches of the evil Palestinian bottle rockets that had, 60% accuracy. Not that 60% accuracy is bad, but again, I will reiterate, that's not what it was built as. They built it as the 95% accuracy, keeping Israel safe from all the terrorists of the world when we sell similar systems to Turkey, Saudi Arabia, etc. Well, we did sell to Turkey, Eastern Europe, and judging mainly, again, Saudi Arabia versus Yemen, these things have about a 60 or 65% success rate, and not the 95 that Israel sets up. And Israel, we've actually put more robust amount into because of the nature of Hamas and Hezbollah and their irregular attacks against Israel. And again, you see similar things with the Houthis, how they attack Saudi Arabia. And again, when you look at it, I would say the Houthis are probably better armed. And I'm not saying the Saudis are benevolent by any means, but I think the Saudis, even just for practical reasons, are less forceful on the Houthis than the Israelis are on Palestinians and Hamas, etc. But again, I think that all comes down to practicality and ability to actually do anything. But it looks like this has simmered down. It looks like, yet again, you will see the Palestinians pushed further and further off their land. You will get these settlements established further and further into the West Bank. And again, Hamas still stands for how much longer? Love them, hate them, they're still there. And you also have to remember, at the end of the day, Hamas, they'll fire their battle rockets, they'll send out their meat shields, but the people in charge of Hamas are aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is in line with pretty much every Sunni jihadist cause in the Middle East, from Libya to Syria to Yemen, etc. Some of them defect on Yemen, but not many, not many. They're anti-Iran, they're pro-Arab Spring, all of this garbage that the State Department, the CIA, the American government, the Israelis have supported. But they will tolerate Hamas firing some bile rockets into Israel to appease the more radical members. But at the end of the day, these people, they are not going to be the ones who can really stand up effectively to Israel. And, it's funny because you see this a lot. Now, I will make the joke again. At this point, Syria has probably killed more members of Hamas than the IDF has. And I'm going to say that outright. But they will be propped up as the opposition. They will be propped up as the main force opposing Israel because they're a convenient boogeyman who isn't really going to do anything of too much consequence when push comes to shove. And this is the most we're going to get out of it. And eventually they will be done away with. Probably once the West Bank is fully settled and colonized, so to speak, and once the majority of the Palestinians, or I don't even know how many Palestinians have been driven out of the West Bank at this point, but once I would say the Israelis secure a demographic majority and the West Bank proper, that's probably when it's going to be Jover for Gaza. That's probably when it's going to be Jover for Hamas, and they'll clear them out and they'll do the same thing there. Now, again, that's banking on several events, who's in the White House, what the situation in the broader Middle East is. Maybe it won't get to that point. Maybe Israel will be too embroiled, or maybe it's just going because at the end of the day, it is a demographic war, and for the longest time, the Palestinians were having more children than the Israelis, which just demographically would overwhelm them. Just and that's how it works, especially if they came to some sort of quote unquote one state solution that democratized the Palestinian population, which means we're probably getting pretty close to the boiling point where definitely the more further right elements of Israel want the Palestinians out. They want them in Egypt, they want them in Syria, they want them in Jordan, they want them anywhere but Israel, the West Bank, or Gaza.
Right. I mean, I agree with most of what you're saying, but I will push back a little bit on two basic issues. One is, and this is the lesser important issue, and that's Hamas's partnership or its cooperation with Iran. I think of all, of any uprising, of any violent interaction with Israel, I think this one, based on their overt communications, uh, establishes definitely a tie between Iran and Hamas. Uh, the leader of Hamas, or one of the leaders of Hamas, even thanked Iran for its support, its missiles, and so on, um, and even agreed, like not agreed, but coordinated what the peace would be like, right? It's this because this isn't. It's not really a war in the way we think of a war. Like these violent acts are there to get concessions. Even Syria, to a great extent, is the same kind of scenario, right? It's a never-ending war, and it's much hotter with far greater casualties, and it doesn't ebb and flow the way the conflict with the Palestinians and the Israelis does. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it is there to get some concessions. But I agree with you. What are the concessions that the Palestinians are going to get out of this, right?
Yes. And
That's very doubtful. I would say, though, um, for them, it is a moral victory. And I would say there's, for me, uh, two reasons for that. One is the kind of blatant irony of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, where the people who run the country, who have the ultimate power and wealth, are literally at the bottom, and at the top are the people who, at the top of the mount, is the holy site and structure, their mosque, which are the people who are underneath them, socioeconomically, ethnically, the list goes on. So, in a sense, like I think this time around, uh, I mean, all the Western countries basically acquiesce. There's been very, very little pushback, with the exception of China and Russia, um, who basically condemned Israel's attacks on Gaza and said that they don't want to see any more civilian deaths. China even published a video on their national news channel, asking, why does America support Israel so much? And it basically linked it to very wealthy, powerful Jews in America. And it stated that they own the media, that they have enormously wealthy, lobbies, and so on and so on. These are all like American right wing talking points. And it's not really afraid of mentioning that. So it's applying its own pressure on Israel, despite the fact that Israel paid for a $1.5 billion salination plant.
Oh yes, and all their different economic deals with China. I remember that being one of Pompeo's biggest sticking points with Israel was all the economic ties Israel had begun with China under the Trump administration, because that really is from 2016, 2017 onwards when Israel and China started to grow closer diplomatically and when they started to really try to court each other because of course the Chinese they're they have an open for business mentality when it comes to the rest of the world. They aren't too picky about ideology or governing party or religion. It seems like, at least for the time being, the goal of Chinese foreign policy is how can we assert our economic influence in X, Y, or Z country? And you see that with the Belt and Road Initiative, you see that with their dealings in the South China Sea, etc. And whether that be Iran, whether that be Israel, it makes no difference to them. If there's a buck to be made, they can have it, which I can admire. I can admire the sheer just pragmatism of their foreign policy. And for all we know, it could just be a temporary measure until they assert themselves more and actually start to act more in ethnic Chinese or ideological interests. Time will tell. I think we're way too early on to see if China will do that, even though historically they've just been a mercantile power that has sought to enrich itself via trade and not really spread Chinese culture. Again, they're very protective of it. They have a very gatekeeping sort of culture. Chinese language, Chinese culture is for Chinese people, not for the outside world. If they want to trade with us, that's great. And in fact, we'll try to dominate them with trade, but they're not good enough for our language and culture, etc. But that's aside the point.
Right,
And
right.
again, if Israel is willing to take whatever money they can get, and also I think they see a wavering United States, even with somebody who rhetorically supported them as much as Trump, and even financially, they know that the American project is faltering, especially after this last summer, especially after this last year, especially when they congratulate Biden and Kamala, and with their visits to Brazil and their courting of Bolsonaro and the Brazilian right. That could be viewed as a dry run for a future America, a more quote unquote diverse America, how much they can wield their influence. Not to mention, Brazil is a pretty wealthy and sizable country. I don't see Brazil becoming an interventionist power or anything, but they can give money to Israel, they can give more legitimacy to Israel by Bolsonaro moving the embassy. But again, you can see and Netanyahu's relationship with Putin and Russia. Um, that's been a constant back and forth. Putin used to be much more pro-Israel and he was much more pro-Western in general. And really, their tango on the Syrian conflict, going back and forth. Netanyahu actually having to travel to Moscow rather than Putin going to Israel, which, again, is a bit of a turn of events when you look at the way the diplomatic structure has been conducted with most countries and Israel. Not saying that Putin is completely he's completely aware of the Zionist question. I'm just saying he's a very pragmatic state actor who knows how to maneuver these ways around his situation, whether or not he likes the country. And again, I don't know what his personal feelings towards Netanyahu and Israel are. I think theoretically he's probably a mild Zionist where he has no problem with the concept of a Jewish state, but I think he's just frustrated because said Jewish state in its current form is impeding Russian interests in the Middle East. But that's aside the point. That's a conversation for a different day. But getting into what he said and what China said about Israel in particular is Russia said they want to stop seeing civilian casualties in Gaza. They want to see a ceasing of the fighting in Gaza. And they gave the order to repatriate all Russians in Gaza. Now, just logically deducing what Russians are there, probably aid workers, people who are there to, again, build hospital camps, those sort of things. That's what most foreigners in Gaza are. There to do aid work because the situation there is so desperate right now and has been since for several decades now. It's not since
Mm-hmm.
I would say since the 1980s, since Hamas really first cropped up and it really became a zone of on and off combat. But you had that, and of course you had the Chinese media piece on the Zionist influence in the United States, and it's looking like, while I said maybe Putin and Xi Jinping aren't ideologically anti-Zionist, maybe Russia and China aren't ideologically anti-Zionist, but it looks like they're willing to put their foot down when they perceive to be an opportunity or threatening their interests, and that's what I think we're looking at right now.
Right. Well, I mean, RT ran a story that you would not see in Western media where Israel condemned China for its blatant anti-Semitism when it showed, let's say, clear ties with very powerful Jewish politicians and the media and so on, and Israel. I mean, China doesn't care. Like, and I think in many ways, China is like they're well aware of, let's say, financial consortiums like BlackRock, who, a month ago said that 50% of its investments are all with China. That's a big deal. I'm not going to get into who BlackRock is, but it pertains absolutely directly because it would be just too long to explain. But it pertains directly to the groups that we're talking about. So China's very willing to put the screws down when it wants to, when it feels like it has to. And you also see like right wing Jews in America and in Britain lately, saying we have to protect Israel because if Israel falls, the West falls. I noticed this kind of chatter. I don't know how much of it is just deep state spooks or people who've really like drank all the Kool-Aid. But that kind of chatter is very interesting because it coincides with like the obvious knowledge that by 2040, 2050, 2060, countries like America, Britain, and France are going to be majority white, right? And the people who live in those countries are not going to be concerned with Israel. They won't be guilted for the Holocaust. So it'll be very difficult to manipulate them.
Like I said,
Uh,
they're doing their experiments in Brazil, so to speak,
yes,
particularly in
yes,
regards to the United States on what a Latin American or Hispanic, I know the Portuguese, the Brazilians aren't exactly Hispanic, but point stands, a country of that sort of cultural extraction will conduct itself, how the cultural narratives will be there, and I think that also goes into the point we're making for the past few episodes about evangelical Christianity and the influence that will continue to play. Where, for example, they do a lot of missionary work in Latin America, particularly in these big countries like
right.
Brazil, like Colombia. Argentina, I don't know how much they do there, but point being is they target these countries with moderate wealth and resources and fair sized populations, and again, get them to believe this Christian Zionist doctrine that they have, I would say, what, 25% of American boomers at least buying into. Now, again, the issue is those religions don't have high retention rates. Nobody, again, their children and their grandchildren will either swear off religion entirely or convert to something else later in life, and you won't get the process you do where it's not. Point being is it's not a reliable base, which is why I think Israel has employed so many rhetorical tactics about itself. For example, save the West, Judeo Christian values, evangelical Christian Zionism, only democracy in the Middle East, gay and women's rights, etc. They try to hit at all those angles on all those
Yes.
bases. And, going back to the demographic question again, that also brings up Israel, where you have the Palestinians having a lot of children. You know who else is having a lot of children in Israel? The
Mm.
ultra Orthodox Jewish
Yes.
population. And this is a
Right.
population that isn't necessarily in line with the more Likud ideas or even more liberal ideas, where they usually find a way to get out of conscription in the Israeli military. Their net tax benefit receivers, again, they receive much more from the taxpayer system than they put into it, and they have like 6 or 7 children. I think their birth rate is it's pretty high. I think it's like 3.4 something. Don't quote me on that, but point being is those are the Jewish people having children in Israel. So you could see a potential future where the only democracy in the Middle East becomes this country where a significant, if not majority, part of the population is these very devout religious Jewish people, and that contradicts with the more secular ethno nationalists of somebody like Likud. And you've seen conflicts erupt between them, and where they actually try to expel those communities. And people joke that, oh, Israel's going to be the next country they get expelled from their own country, and at this rate, it might be true with what they're doing to the Palestinians, and quite a few of them, funny enough, live in the Palestinian territory. So it's not only a demographic powder keg in all these Western countries, but in Israel itself. And again, that's not to say the rest of the world is like demographically stable. Russia, China, India, they all have their own problems. But in regards to the West, which is the conversation we're having right now, and in Israel, again, it's a demographic powder keg all around.
Right, right. And actually, just to return to the second point I wanted to make, which was notice that there was no ground invasion of the Gaza Strip. Uh, you know that Hamas probably has anti-tank weapons, and I think part of the reason for this was also to demonstrate that after Lebanon with Hezbollah, Israel it cannot, like, it's between a rock and a hard place. It can't go in with tanks because it's afraid of massive losses again, afraid of being embarrassed like that. So it has to resort to extremely heavy, powerful bombs, including white phosphorus, in order to in order to gain victory. But in doing so, that creates a very bad optics scenario. So I think that's where the strategy is.
Yeah, I would agree. It's, again, putting them in that no-win situation. And again, I'm at a loss. Like, I don't like to project too far into the future. I try to keep my predictions a decade at most, but even just a decade down the road when it comes to the Israel-Palestine issue, I don't know who's going to come out on top of this. There's so many factors that's dependent on, and again, I would say Israel's in the worse off position when it comes to finding a guarantor outside of the region, because they'll try these peace deals with the Arabs, with the Gulf states, but as American influence continues to decline, how motivated, how incentivized will countries like Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, I, I don't think Qatar was one of them, but the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, that's what I was thinking of, Saudi Arabia, how motivated will they be outside of the threat of Iran, which we'll see how that goes, to cooperate with Israel? Or will they
Yeah.
swear them off and play to their majority devout Sunni Muslim populations? And again, it's a good deflection. Foreign issues are very good deflection for middling to poor domestic conditions. Sure, life might not be the best here, but we have a bigger enemy to focus on right now. Every country does that. U.S. does it with Russia and China. Russia does it with the West. China does it with the U.S. Middle Eastern countries do it with each other all the time. And again, I'm not saying it's a good or a bad thing. It's just it's just a reality. People like to project their problems, and sometimes these things are genuine threats. Sometimes they're played up. It all is just circumstantial. But point being is, after American influence declines, which I would say is almost inevitable at this point, I think we're seeing it day by day, will these Arab countries honor their deals with Israel? I see no way in which that happens. I see no way in which Iran isn't a massive threat. Now, Iran, again, will still be a thorn in the side, and that depends on how their nuclear program goes. I see no way countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, etc., make nice with Israel and don't revert to maybe like a 1973 situation. And I think the other one we're not considering is the Jordanians here. The Jordanians, you already had King Abdullah coming out and saying this is the worst our relations have ever been with Israel in the past 40 years. And that's post, of course, peace treaty they after the 73 war, of course, when Jordan more or less capitulated to them. And you have the issues of the treaties with the watering rights for the West Bank and Israel, and again, the irrigation treaties. I think we covered that, what was that, a year and a half, 2 years ago, when those were set to expire and they were having issues renegotiating those. So, again, we'll see how that plays out. We'll see how all the foreign. Again, I do think one linchpin people overlook in the Middle East is Jordan, because it will roll over to whoever has the upper hand. You could see American troops in Jordan, you could see Israeli troops in Jordan, you could see Russian troops, hell, maybe even Turkish troops, depending on it. And I would say, I would say overall Turkey is the most important country in the Middle East when it comes to actually having a global impact. But I would say the Jordanians are pretty high up there. I'd probably put them as, I don't know, third or fourth after Turkey, Israel, and Iran. And again, those three all vacillate depending on the situation, the time, and the place. Over, I'd say, the past 30 years since the end of the Cold War. But again, it's so unpredictable at this point that I can't say that. But speaking of Turkey, we got some news on
Mhm.
Armenia, and you were telling me about this, so I'll let you take care of this one.
Well, so this is about the conflict. There's another potential conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. I might have mentioned this in the last episode. I think it did, where Azerbaijani troops had come into Armenian territory. They were escorted by Russian troops back to the border. There was an either at the same border or in a different area. Azerbaijani troops again crossed into that area. Armenian troops then went in. Then Armenian troops started to amass. And so, I've seen some videos where they're shooting at each other, but it's basically there to make them, go back to their own territory. This is very low key stuff. They're not trying to wipe out each other. Um, I don't know even of any casualties or deaths so far, but you could see that Azerbaijan thinks like they deserve even more than what they got. It could be that ultimately what they're after is to boot Russia out of there. Ironically, of course, Russia has offered to hold peace negotiations between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So, I mean, for me, I think, Azerbaijan doesn't really do anything completely on its own unless it has like a really big partner. And in this case, the two suspects are Turkey and the US.
I would just say
That,
the apparatus of NATO in general at this point.
yes, yes. Yeah, I think that's a simple and effective way of describing it. So now nothing has come of it just yet, but you don't know. You don't
And
know.
speaking of NATO, there was some interesting news regarding Armenia where you had mass demonstrations, or quote unquote mass demonstrations, where people were signing petitions to have Armenia join NATO and to boot out Turkish and Russian troops. And that's the big push, even after Pashinyan's
Yeah,
embarrassing failure and defeat at the hands of Azeri forces, and again his scorning of Russia, this man who rode to power on a Soros color revolution, promising to get the Russians out and saying Armenia is going to stand firm and independent, of course within the Western sphere of influence, but no
yeah,
less. And their solution to sticking it to the Turks is joining NATO, which second largest military
y-
force in NATO,
yeah,
probably one of the most important after the United States, where they're really the linchpin of it. They're really the ones, the mover and shaker of NATO, I would say, after the United States is Turkey, because of just how geographically influential they are. And again, you still have enough of the Armenian population duped in the idea that Macron or Biden will come to save the day. Again, not to say that
yeah,
like Russia is the most benevolent ruler ever, but after how many, at this point, centuries of cooperation have the Armenians, I would say, had it better under Russian influence than Turkish or Western influence? And really, I know that those sentiments, from my understanding at least, maybe there's an Armenia expert out there who can help us out with this. Maybe we need to get Vile Varangian back on. This is his region after all. Yeah, what he doesn't tell you is that he's a feared man of the Caucasus. Now, don't quote me on that. I'm just quoting my source, but that's beside the point. But what you have with that, just beside the point, is you have, I would say, enough of the Armenian population that is still at least tolerant of Russia enough to keep them out of this situation, but they're trying really hard. I mean,
Yeah,
after they more or less capitulated with Georgia, and Georgia's having its own political crisis right now. Not only the U.S. state of Georgia, but the country of Georgia as well. Both are in a pretty big state of political turmoil. I
they
might
are.
get in some of the election stuff next week. I just don't really think it's developed enough to get into this week with the audits and the vote counts, etc. But again, that's aside the point. But once again, you have this big push after the failing of color revolutions in Ukraine, in Belarus, in even Moldova. Moldova had a brief one, and they think they can really win it in Armenia because I would say probably because it's just a blip on the radar, just a very physically small country locked up in the mountains, uh, just really sticking it to Russia in their own backyard. But it doesn't appear to be working. And if anything, it appears that people like Pashinyan have capitulated more to Russian support. And you had the president of Armenia and the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the military come out about 2, 3 months ago and outright say that Pashinyan is unfit to be a leader. People were fearing a coup. And these weren't necessarily liberals, these weren't bureaucrats, these weren't pro Western people. They weren't necessarily pro Russian, but again, that shows the sentiments of the pro Western movement in Armenia. I think it's hyped up much more than it actually is. Again, there's not even enough media coverage, I would say, to constitute what would be a color revolution. But of course, you have just the actors on the ground, as you always do. And again, I repeat myself over and over when it comes to these sort of stories because the same thing just keeps happening again and again.
Yeah.
Very repetitive
Well,
news cycle over the past year, but it gets more and more interesting every time, from what I've noticed at least.
well, I mean, you can tell that this most recent political movement, if you can even call it that, in Armenia is astroturfed because it's they're the most naive desires you could even imagine. The idea that Armenia would be put into NATO and Turkey would be kicked out and Russia would be subdued is like the most self-aggrandized idea of a country. Like, I mean, even Kosovo doesn't go this far.
This is the mindset. This is a 2014, pre 2014 mindset. I would say, especially in the Caucasus after Georgia, this is a pre 2008 mindset. This is like what
It's
would have been
delusional.
expected in the early 2000s, if not late 90s, when countries like Poland, when countries like Romania were being admitted into the EU and NATO. But it seems like they're about 15 years behind in rhetoric and just geopolitical shifts to the point where they think this is a possibility right now.
Yeah, I mean, I would even wager that if Russia were even as weak as it was in the 90s, Turkey would still be a NATO partner simply for the kind of reach, the kind of diving board, as it were, that it offers America. Now, I, I agree. I know what some people are probably already thinking. Well, Turkey isn't that cooperative anymore, so does it still stand? Well, I would say that it does because it's temporary. Erdogan isn't always going to be president, and let's say that Russia is subdued. The likelihood of Turkey being more compliant with American interests, the kind that we saw in the 2000s, um, would reemerge. I mean, Turkey since 2015 is a very well, I would say 2016 is a very different beast. It's difficult to gauge at the moment how much course Erdogan has set, but I think to be fair to him, I think he has. I don't think whoever replaces Erdogan is going to be able to reverse everything and become a NATO member that America would be happy with.
Well, I think it's similar to France and Macron, where these sentiments existed, and it took one person to tap into it before they passed the point of no return, because they would have remained latent for who knows how long until you got a president in there, in France or Turkey respectively, who said, hey, maybe we can do it this way instead. And when they saw mild success, or maybe things didn't change at all but didn't get worse, all of a sudden it played that way. And now Turkey has
Yeah,
actually seen economic decline, so has France. But again, those are broader factors, and especially with some of the U.S. sanctions on Turkey. that just plays more into the narrative. They're sanctioning us because they know we're right, because they know we can stand up to them. But again, it was these sentiments that were bubbling under the surface because of a series of just previous decisions. I would say dating back to the end of the Cold War. I think so that's really the key date in all of this, and
Yeah.
how
Well,
all.
I think you rightly point the way towards kind of perennial issues that Turkey always has with Europe. And they've been there before the one, they'll be there after.
Yeah, pretty much until as long as that land remains Turkish and the Turks remain the people they are, which are again Sunni Muslims of a mixed genetic background of various Europeans and Central Asians. As long as Turkey holds its current makeup, which it has since the past 600 years, and I don't
At
see
least.
any reason that's going to change anytime soon, unless the Kurds just have a massive demographic explosion and Turkey becomes Kurdistan, or unless the Greeks get together and there's a third Balkan war and they really retake Constantinople, etc. Now, as much as I'd love to see something like that happen, I'm not banking on it anytime in the near future.
Yeah.
But again, just to keep that decade time frame, looking down the road in 2030 or 2031, things aren't going to change. And again, even the 2040s and 2050s, I don't see things changing that much either. But again, with Armenia, it's I I can only wonder how much longer they'll keep on trying to push the illusion that Armenia is going to westernize, that Armenia has interest in joining the EU and NATO and all these Western organizations. And really, again, because the only way I see it, and I could be wrong, is that they just accept their fate as a Russian satellite, because I see no other way going forward unless they're going to, again, I don't see even NATO taking them in at this point. I don't even think it'd be worth the trouble for NATO. If they, now again, they've taken in countries like Montenegro and Macedonia, but again, Serbia is admittedly in a much weaker position. Now is really the time to strike at the heart of Serbia. I mean, they've almost gotten them to capitulate to the European Union, and I wouldn't be surprised if, again, now, depending on the stability of the European Union, maybe if the European Union has a few just years of being relatively normal, they might admit a country like Serbia, but I know they've vetoed several Balkan states thanks to the French in the past couple years here. But again, I don't even think Armenia would be worth the trouble for them to try to integrate into these Western alliances and organizations.
Armenia is much more complicated than even a country like Georgia. And Georgia it has been waiting to join NATO for, I mean, we're approaching close to 20 years. You know, even before 2008, during their conflict with Russia, uh, as far back as 2006, they seemed that that there was a path forward for them to be part of NATO and part of the EU, and that none of that ever materialized. And a part of
And
that
how much of a
is
slap
like,
in the face would that be if the Armenians got into NATO before them, just speaking hypothetically? Or I would say even if the Ukrainians got into NATO before Georgia, with Georgia
yeah,
expressing an interest for far longer in the situation, being far more, I would say, receptive to the sort of program NATO has to put in front of them, mainly because there's less ethnic Russians there. But again, what slap in the face would it be for any member into NATO before Georgia at this point? And I don't know, Georgia, I don't imagine how they're not feeling pretty spurned by adding Montenegro and Macedonia in before them with how long they've been trying to get in.
right. I think there's several reasons, but one of the main reasons is how good of a strategic partner they are. Another one I should mention is, what do they really have to offer? Now, on paper, obviously Georgia flanks Russia directly, unlike Macedonia and Montenegro. But Russia has influence amongst Orthodox Slavs living in the Balkans, like Montenegro, Macedonia, Serbia, etc., and has historically had for centuries. Uh, but I would say the reason that NATO it was successful in integrating them partly was because there was one, they're not complex in order to bring in. Two, they don't have a lot of significance, particularly for Russia. Like, there's less significance. what can Montenegro and Macedonia really offer NATO except a symbolic victory, an optic victory over Russia? That's it. There really isn't that much. Most of the issue with them joining NATO is to isolate Serbia. That's its main objective, not Russia.
Yeah, like I said,
Um,
Serbia is the weakest link, so to speak. And again, just with Vucic in power and the recent political history of Serbia, as we've discussed on the show over the past 2.5, 3 years, with how close they've come to just kissing the ring already and getting it over with and accepting their fate, like almost every other former Yugoslav country has, from Slovenia to Croatia. I think Bosnia is funny enough the only other one that hasn't, just because they're such an ethnic. What's the word? What's the YouTube friendly word
Mixed
for it?
bag.
Hodgepodge. There we go.
Yeah.
I know what I really want to say, but I'm going to restrain myself. But I think Bosnia and Serbia are the only two that hadn't capitulated, to the point where
Yeah.
even Kosovo, which isn't even an officially recognized state, has given more into, which isn't a surprise seeing their history and how they were formed. But I mean, you like I said, you have Slovenia, you have Croatia, you have Montenegro, you have Macedonia. They've all capitulated, and again, it seems natural that it is a surrounding of the Serbs, and that unless things change fast, and I don't know, the European Union could have a few bad years here. European Union influence in Serbia is probably going to overtake it. Now, granted, they've hedged their bets with Russia and especially China as of late. There's been a lot of Chinese activity in Serbia, so they may not be down for the count yet, but I think that makes it all the more crucial for them to press down on them, and I think it's a much more attainable goal than collapsing Russia at the current moment.
Right. So yeah. So statelets like Macedonia and Montenegro are not like they're no big enchiladas, right? They're not really a great big feather in America's cap. Um, Take for instance, I mean, Ukraine of all these countries that we've mentioned is a farm is literally the most important strategic goal that America has. Period. End of story. There is, and look at the hesitancy that America's had to even really militarily fund them to a great extent. Look at the unwillingness to even engage more directly Russians in eastern Ukraine, or even the cat and mouse games that are played in the Black Sea. That's a you know this is the strategic partner. You tear this away, it's arguable that Russia is done unless something miraculous happens later. Like that's not an exaggeration, and yet America has not really succeeded. It has not been able to move on this.
I mean, the last time Russia hadn't
So
controlled the Ukraine in any like serious capacity, because you could say, especially now controlling Crimea, which is the most important part of it, with their vast amount of influence in the east, the last time they hadn't controlled it, it was when it was under Polish-Lithuanian rule in the 1600s, when you had Polish troops in Moscow. That's how far back we have to reach here. Now, again, there's been brief periods, such as both world wars, where the Germans temporarily occupy them, but like I'm between World War One and World War Two. Look at how quickly that Ukraine has been reabsorbed into Russia. This has been actually, again, I think most people just looking at historical trends would have expected at least the Ukraine to be reabsorbed in Russia. At least everything east of the Dnieper, maybe not Kiev proper, but point being is, again, it is that dagger pointed right at Russia, and it is
yeah,
the most crucial part of it, and it is that red line for them, to the point where of course they want Ukraine to NATO. Of course they want Ukraine to do all these things, but they know it has to be just the right moment when Russia cannot react before they go in there, because that is when all bets are off with the Russians. That is
right,
their
right,
backyard. I mean, most Russians, I would say, view it as, at least the eastern part of Ukraine, as Russia proper. Now, I could be wrong about that, and again, maybe we might have to bring Vile Varangin back to clarify on the proper Russian views on the Ukraine, but point being is, at least as far as the Russian state is concerned, the way Russia conducts itself diplomatically, Ukraine is a no-go zone.
yeah. So if Ukraine is this difficult, imagine to absorb into NATO. Just imagine the complexity with, let's say, Georgia or Armenia, uh, because they offer less strategic significance and uh, particularly Armenia is very unstable, and there's not much that they can offer for. So it's not like they're not a real priority.
And with all that being said, I think we have to talk about the other big topic of this week, which is Nord
Mm.
Stream 2. Now,
Yeah.
Joe Biden, after talking a big tough game on how we're going to stick it to Russia, on how we're going to really punish Putin for what he did for hacking the election, whatever, has decided, in his infinite wisdom, to waive Nord Stream 2 sanctions on the Russian end. Now, Germany, those sanctions are still going to be applied to Germany. But again, this looks like Joe Biden has been taking the advice of some people in our circles saying, let the Europeans have the Russian gas. What difference does it make to us? We got our own problems. And of course, with some of the leaked statements he said about demographics from just after the election, which we may get into next week when it, again,
Yeah, yeah.
but that's all aside the point. But it looks like on the surface, Joe Biden has thrown up the white flag to the Russians and let them have their energy market in Europe. But it looks like what's happening in actuality, he realizes, or at least his team realizes, touching the Russians, hitting them on that, especially with how complete it is already, that's not going to do anything. We've tried sanctions for the past, 7 years at this point, and that has had no success. Past, 7 years at this point has had no success. And what they're trying to do now is sanctioning the German side, sanctioning the Europeans, particularly the Germans, for consuming this energy. And I think it's two pronged. I think it's both practical and I think it's symbolic. Where again, practicality, it's much easier to crack down on the Germans economically because of how much intertwined we are, and how much Russia has managed to resist through economic partnership with China, through its own domestic industry and economy. But I do think one angle a lot of people have missed with this, if they even know about the sanction of Germany, is Germany is firmly within the Western sphere. Probably the epitome of an American occupied country, down to culture, down to economy, down to troop levels. I mean, what is it? 30,000 American troops still stationed in Germany post Cold War, post World War II for the past almost 80 years at this point. But what we have here is a punishment of insolence. Germany, which was part of the Western Alliance, which was part of the Western sphere, stepped out of line according to the policy wonks and the ruling class in Washington, D.C., and in London and Brussels. And they are now being punished for it. They're being showed the price of disobedience, which is we will sanction your gas, we will sanction your energy sales, and they're having the green revolution pushed on them. They've cut back consumption in coal in exchange for alternative energies, of course. And again, this amounts to a punishment for their influence against the global liberal system. And really, I think this is the beginning of what we're going to see a long meddling campaign in Germany leading up to the September 2021 election.
Definitely. Yeah, there's some really interesting takeaways because I've heard some excuse making. Biden, and this is to put it into context. We mentioned how schizophrenic Trump's policy was when he was in office. Biden, in his first 100+ days, is absolutely par for the course or worse. Um, you have to think because the excuses are Biden has to maintain friendships with America's allies that Trump ruined. Well, I mean, if you're going to punish them for Nord Stream 2, why wouldn't you just levy more tariffs or let's say more sanctions against Russia? Or why not just keep resisting and not let off what is ostensibly a government-owned oil company that's building this pipeline. So uh, it makes no sense to sanction Germans for going along with the pipeline. Um, yeah, I mean, I'm at a loss for words. And I honestly didn't think he would capitulate like this, which makes me think, like, are there concessions that are being made somewhere else? Is there a plan that we're going to see develop after the election in September with Merkel leaving, particularly if the Greens win? It's hard to say. There's a excellent chance that the Nord Stream 2 will be completed by then anyways. As for Germany and their energy needs, they, of course, are meeting these targets to reduce coal. They were Europe's largest coal user, but they've also done away with nuclear energy. So that doesn't give them much choice except gas and oil. And so they're in a bind about getting basically the cheapest gas and the cheapest oil possible in a reliable way to meet their green targets. And America, of course, has been adamant about it. And optically, it's going to be difficult to stand against that when there is no other alternative other than taking, American gas and oil.
Which, with the
So yeah,
domestic energy policy of the United States currently, that creates a bit more of a precarious situation because at least under Trump, you had the continuation of Obama era energy policies such as the drilling in North Dakota and the drilling off the Gulf and the Keystone Pipeline, but a lot of that has been shut down by Biden, and that
yeah,
certainly curtails American energy interests, which puts things back in the hands of mainly the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, etc. Even Iran. And we'll see with Biden's Iran policy because before Trump tore up the JCPOA and before he really started to implement sanctions and there were the conflicts with the oil tankers being seized and blown up. So prior to 2018, 2019, you had quite a few European countries using Iranian fuel. You had Japan also using Iranian fuel. And a lot of that has been curtailed since Trump really implemented his anti Iran policy, his policy of quote unquote maximum pressure. And as Biden's administration continues negotiations with the Iranians, we could see that door open up too, where you get this strange system where we try to prevent them from buying oil and gas from Russia, but we let them get their energy imports from the Iranians as well as the Persian Gulf. So it could come
yeah.
back yet again to the Middle East, which should surprise no one. And because, again, I doubt Biden is going to have any change of heart when it comes to the energy industry of the United States. I think there's too much invested in the green lefty movement, at least appeasing them politically, to, for example, lift the restrictions on some of this drilling or on the Keystone Pipeline, etc. But again, it once again goes back to energy policy of the Middle East, and really that keeps us more entrenched there. But depending on how that goes, and with the growing Russian Chinese influence there, it could get a lot more complex. Where, yeah, sure, they're buying oil from Iran. That's only alleviating pressure on Iran, which is pretty solidly aligned itself with the Russians and Chinese at this point. And again, it just becomes so twisted and complicated. Unless they're going to drill up some more Romanian oil, even though I thought that was mostly, if not all, dried up. Drill some more oil off the coast of Denmark or the UK, up by the Arctic. But again, we'll see. We'll see how that plays out. And again,
I mean, a pipeline could have been built from the North Sea or off the coast of Britain or Scotland.
the
Uh,
Nord Stream.
yeah, yeah. So I mean, it's there. You could have done it, but who knows? Maybe their reserves aren't as deep as those of Russia.
Well, of
I
course
will
not.
a little other news from Europe pertaining to Russia is the news coming out of the EU suggests emphatically stating, in fact, that there needs to be a regime change in Russia. And the way they're going to go about it is produce yet another freedom channel, 24/7 news, uh, with a total obsession with Russia. They're going to use Bellingcat, which is, well, it's no longer part of the EU, and it's basically just a government-run thing operation. So, to for their sleuthing and their news stories and so on. Uh, because according to the EU president, for Putin's crimes against democracy and Russians, it's hysterical, it's laughable. Uh, Putin enjoys like a 56% approval rating from from people who can actually vote,
Yeah, and again,
and
the ones who
his next
oppose
closest
him, it's
competitor is
yeah. I was about to steal your thunder there, but yeah, the people who oppose him are the ones who think, frankly, doesn't go far enough.
right. Many of them, yes. And the fact of the matter is, all of them are in the single digits of approval. So they're not even close. Second place is a single digit. So is third and fourth and so on and so on. So um, I think, basically time is running out. There's a kind of desperation about all of this. A lot of Europeans don't even know who their representative is in the EU per se. So it'll be interesting to see them trying to get this off the ground. Russia's good. They're in a bind. They need the gas, but they don't like the president, and they want to have the best of both. They want to have their cake and eat it too.
Yes,
Um,
and again, that creates an interesting dynamic as these quote unquote populist parties that are more conciliatory to Russia, you may think, the National Rally or AFD or Lega, it presents a two pronged threat to the European establishment to the point where they have no issue cooperating with Putin's Russia on the level of, again, they won't criticize him for oppressing journalists or locking up Navalny, and they'll be more than happy to buy his oil and gas. And again, it presents a threat of liberalism in their country, the fact that they threaten to shake up the liberal order. So those that brings to bring the European election element into it. It proposed a two pronged threat, and again, we'll see how that rhetoric gets used in September 2021 and April 2022 when it comes to the German and French elections, respectively. But you do make a great point about how what they really want is another Yeltsin back in power, somebody who will
yeah.
freely and openly cooperate with them, let Russian assets be owned by, dominated by oligarchs, not that there's no oligarchs in Russia today, and by foreign interests. And really, that's what the end goal of what the Eurocrats are. Whereas the United States would like to see a complete and utter collapse of Russia, probably a balkanization. These European powers are willing to tolerate it if there is somebody like Yeltsin or maybe even Navalny at this point in power. Some stooge that will be an easy pushover for them, is the point I'm trying to make.
Right. So it'll be all about Europeans can have huge shares, even majority shares, like they did in the 90s in Russian companies, but Russian companies can't possibly have that uh, in Europe. So that's the irony of this whole thing.
And one last topic I want to cover before we put an end to the show is you sent me an interesting story about Apple in China. Oh boy, we've heard this one before, haven't we? And their acquiescence to China, and really just how tech companies have been behaving lately. And again, they've been involved in large scale surveillance on behalf of the Chinese, which isn't really a surprise. These companies are ideologically motivated insofar as they can push things like the LGBTQ CIA stuff, like women's empowerment, so long as it increases their profits and makes society more atomized and into better consumers. But they're very pragmatic and very non ideological when it comes to finding a state actor to cooperate with and who will protect them. And as the American empires, the American state has faltered and has failed to, and again, as they got unstable figures like Trump in there, I think we're seeing the beginning of a movement. I don't think we're in full swing at all by any means, and this could be cut short. Of several companies, particularly tech companies, seeking a sort of refuge among the Chinese state, that they will be their protector and that they will be the ones who really keep them afloat and maybe, of course, not like move their headquarters there or anything, but somebody they can cooperate with the way they used to cooperate with the United States government. Again, a state actor to act as a protector and ally of them. And I think we're starting to see that develop with stories like this leaking, with stories we've seen over the past several years. And again, I think time will tell. Let's see what a lot of these people like Zuckerberg and Bezos and all these other people do in the relationship with China. And again, this is all speculation. This is a new phenomenon I've noticed developing. New isn't a few years, but I do think we're beginning to see a trend of these various companies starting to lose confidence in the United States as a global power and taking their business elsewhere, quite literally.
Yeah, it would appear to be the case, which I think does lend credence to certain lines of critique and argument that, although China correctly has diagnosed, the white liberal in America, um, his or her preferences, their worldview, the kind of utopic vision that they want, their behavior, their mores and their behavior. Um, China is definitely okay with empowering that within America in a kind of indirect way. Uh, so that is a facet, absolutely, and who knows? I would say there's probably truth that China is playing definitely a long game. Like, I mean, if we can figure out that this sort of thing erodes a country, even if in the short term it uh, creates more profits, that it eventually erodes it. Obviously, China's model is not America's model at all. Um, so China has to be aware of the kind of impact it has by having so much influence over someone like Apple. Apple routinely boasts about how much safer it is and trustworthy it is compared to Android phones, and so on and so on. But obviously, that's not the case.
Yes, and again, I think we will see this trend, and it is funny because when you get a lot of the mainstream right, a lot of the new right, and have these talking points about CCP controlled America and all these companies cooperating with the Chinese Communist Party, well, I think number one, it goes beyond ideology, and I was actually discussing this on Twitter of all places a few weeks back that the CCP is actually one of the more moderate elements in China when you consider the bulk of their censorship efforts have been suppressing Han nationalism, and these people really, again, can only be described as racial supremacists in China who view their destiny as an outright race war with the European and the African to assert Chinese Asian hegemony over the world. But again, not that that's really common in China, but again, more hardline nationalist views are regularly suppressed by the Chinese Communist Party. But point being is, you have a lot of the boomers talk about Chinese influence and Chinese bought and paid for corporations and politicians, but again, I do think they are touching on an element of truth. I think they're misreading the situation, but I
Yeah,
do think it's certainly true that what we're seeing now is corporations finding China as a, again, not even for like a base of operations, not even for a headquarters, but they're finding them a more appealing protector and state partner than the United States as we continue to falter and flounder. And of course, you had Biden out there with his rhetoric saying the future will be made in America, out there really trying to show that we can compete with China, we can compete with India, we can compete with Russia, etc. But again, just the direction that I would say these companies that are arguably more powerful than the United States government with how much influence they have over Western governments and how close they are to even non-Western governments such as Turkey, such as China, even to a degree Russia. I remember seeing a story a few weeks back that Russia forced Twitter to take down something that violated one of their laws. I think it had something more to do with copyright than actual politics, but again, that's aside the point. But point being is, these companies that are arguably just powerful, if not more powerful than the United States, are seeing China as a more appealing partner in all of this. Should be concerning in the sense that, wow, things are really changing. The tide's really turning. There's your episode title drop. I knew I would get that one in there eventually this episode. And that really, a lot of these people who again, maybe bastards. You may not like Zuckerberg or Bezos or any of these people, but they are admittedly intelligent people. Are seeing the way the tides are turning and jumping ship and really trying to adapt to what could be called the Chinese century, or maybe in a more fair term, maybe in a term that's a bit more realistic, the multipolar century.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, these are the same people who actively employed measures, influenced governments all throughout the West that were there to meet their bottom line. And we have their woke ideology as a result. But they will go where the markets are, and if the market in Asia is booming and that's where it is, that's where they'll go. And obviously, they can be made to shut their lying mouths if the bottom line is threatened. If there's a government that's willing to threaten them, they will comply. Uh, I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think one of the reasons is that China is a supply country in the same way that, like, let's say Ireland, England, France, Germany are supply countries. What I mean by that is they're supply countries in terms of people. And America is not like America absorbs diasporas and it has not developed an ethnogenesis. And even when it could have or almost have, right? Its elites have always managed to thwart those efforts. China's not playing that game, obviously, and they've been immensely successful in maintaining their what they would consider their homogeneity. Their ethnogenesis is there, which is broader than just race.
Yes, and you may
Um,
not believe that China is 90% Han like the official statistics claim they do, but these non Han groups are clearly submitting to the ruling class, to the majority, whereas in the United States you may have a ruling class, and again, it's changed based on what area you go to. It used to be the WASP elite, now it's sort of the WASP Jewish, some token white ethnic elite, and we're increasingly getting the Indian Brahmin and East Asian elite mixed in with the other Jewish and WASP elements. But point being is, they haven't made us conform to any other culture except the fact that we'll have a working understanding of English, and that's sort of gone out the window, and consume pop culture product. That's the quote unquote ethnogenesis they formed on the American continent. Where again, as in China, maybe their statistics about 90% of the population being Han Chinese is false, but Han Chinese is the dominant culture, it's the dominant ruling class, and pretty much anyone who is important is either Han Chinese or at least conducts themselves as Han Chinese, speaks their language, follows their cultural customs, etc.
right, and so I guess my point is because America's always been this kind of propositional nation, bordering on the possibility of creating an ethnogenesis and evolving past the point of propositionalism, i.e., their constitution. It never has. And there are, various periods of time where that was closed. There are various groups that wanted to stop it. And ultimately, in the end, the reason for that was money. And I think that's why they cannot. I think China understands that. That's why you can bully these corporations, whereas those corporations can literally bully, uh, let's say, foundational Americans, but other Americans as well.
Yes, I would agree. Pretty much anyone on the broad right wing spectrum, foundational Americans, Anglo Saxons, Scots, Irish, etc., even increasingly white ethnics, sort of the forgotten middle child of America, and even the based minority conservatives who support Trump and that kind of stuff. The black guy in the MAGA hat. He's fair game. Diamond Silk, whatever their names were. But point being is, you do have that, and you do have these companies which, again, in many ways can act as proxies for state actors, because when Twitter or Facebook or wherever bans some prominent political figure, that's not the government keeping them quiet. Sure, they're just banned from every means of modern communication and financial processing, but it's not the government that's doing it. And again, these people can do this for multiple governments. I mean, Turkey regularly, at least used to regularly shut down Twitter, and at least on the Turkish side of Twitter, have suppressed several things. Tech companies' relationship with China, as we've been going over, even Russia, and again, or look at, you want a Western example, look how much they comply to German hate speech laws. That is
Mhm.
through the roof. Especially YouTube. How many YouTube videos are blocked in Germany? You know what? I wonder if this channel is blocked in Germany. I really don't know. We might be small enough not to be, but Germany casts a really large net of channels that they ban. So who knows? Who knows? But that's all I had for the week.
Yeah, that's about it for me too.
So thank you everyone for tuning in to this episode of the War Report. It's been an interesting last few weeks here, and I imagine that the news probably isn't slowing down anytime soon. So we will see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Take care.